Hare Krishna, this is Rambhru Dasi at bhakticare.blogspot.com or YouTube channel Bhakti Care. I'd like to begin this small clip by talking about the importance of feelings, one's emotions, in being able to be a healing presence for others. So often my students who begin this program come with a very, very large store of theology. They're very well versed in their theology, their philosophy. They've been at seminary for 4 to 8 years, sometimes more. Some of them have been parish ministers for 20 years, and so they are very, very used to reading scripture, quoting scripture, telling stories, commenting on stories, which is a really wonderful skill, and it does have its place. But in spiritual caregiving, the most important tool we have is ourself and our own ability to connect with our emotions as a means of connecting with another person's emotions. So I start my students off with a big list. I have a list of all the different ways we talk about anger, all the different words that we use to describe and talk about grief, sadness, all the different words we use to describe anxiety, fear, anger, frustration, all these different, we go through these, and first I have us write on the board some of the primary emotions like anxiety, grief, gladness, fear. And then we just brainstorm all the different things that we use to describe or talk about different degrees and flavors of those emotions. Then we do some role play to listen to one of our peers, for another student, to listen to them tell a story. And then we try to pick out what is the story behind the story. Everybody, when they tell a story, has a meta story, and we call it's the story behind the story. And in counseling, it's just really important to be able to listen with one's third ear. We have the idea of the third eye, being able to see something beyond what's physically present. But in counseling, you have to develop this third ear, this ability to hear what a person's real story is underneath the facts and the figures and the content of the actual story. So people wonder, oh, why is that so important? Let's just pray, let's do some ritual, and let me tell them an inspiring story, and then they'll get back to the path, or whatever that path is. They get back to doing their service or chanting Hare Krishna. And that may give them some temporary relief. Often we call this, in the counseling profession, we call this pseudo support. You have encouraged them, you have inspired them, they're back up, get back to work. That's what we want you to do anyway. We can't afford the time for you to have time to grieve your grief. We can't spare the time. Things are moving fast. And we're very task-oriented in the West, and so often, people get a little pat on the back, they get a little, what we call blowing on a boil. You have a festering wound on your arm, and what it desperately needs is to be cut and let the pus come out. And what we're doing is blowing on the boil or putting a little Band-Aid on it, and it doesn't really go away. So the same concept, metaphorically, is what's going on in unprocessed emotions in our lives when we have had a deep pain that we've experienced. It could be from a broken marriage. It could be from the loss of a loved one. It could be from growing up in an abusive home where you have mom and dad who didn't get along, and so as a child you saw them fighting all the time, or you saw dad beating mom, or you heard a lot of abusive language, some of it directed at you. So you learn as you grow up how to cope by stuffing those emotions or putting them somewhere and interpreting them in a certain way so that you can somehow survive. These are survival skills. But what happens over time is when you encounter stress in our normal daily life, things happen when we're in anxiety, we regress to some of those traumatic times. And it's kind of like our inner child, where we go back to that fear or that way of being, and revisit that by projecting that fear onto what's happening in the current moment. Um, a typical issue we've had in ISKCON, and I've seen it in the Catholic Church, and I see it even in the students I work with, is unresolved relationships with parents. The parent can be still operative in their life, whereas a person has not differentiated and become an adult, so that they are able to take responsibility for what's going on in their life, making choices and owning those choices. And when something happens, we are now blaming everyone: the authorities, the gurus, the teachers, the church, the temple, the organization, for what's wrong with me. And a lot of that has to do with unprocessed early life parental relationships. So as a spiritual care provider, it's really, really important to be open to hearing the whole story. We are story catchers as chaplains. We are not story tellers. There may be appropriate times when we can share a little piece of our life experience as a means of helping a person tell us more. And of course, our job is to invite them to tell their story and be able to help them connect with the emotions around that for their own healing. I have this image in my mind around what we do that I have drawn from an experience I had in India when I was living in Vrindavan, when one of the devotees had a tapeworm, and she was becoming more and more emaciated and more hungry, and this tapeworm that had crawled in through a crack in her heel and attached itself somehow to her stomach. As she was feeding herself, the tapeworm was eating all her food, and it became enormous. I mean, it must have been 3 or 4 foot long, living inside of her and taking all the energy away from her, and she was dying. So she called in, I don't know, it was a long time ago, but the temple called in a person who knew how to get this tapeworm out. And the way that they did it was to hold a hot bowl of hot milk in front of this girl's mouth. And the tapeworm smelled the hot milk and came up her throat to get it. I mean, she stopped eating for several days so that the tapeworm was hungry, and then the snake came out of her mouth. And when it started to come out the mouth for the milk, when its head poked out, the shaman or the healer grabbed that snake and pulled the entire thing out. And of course, she was free from the imprisonment by this snake. This story is relevant for me because, and for what I do as a spiritual care provider, is that the whole idea behind listening to a person's emotional content, particularly those pains that have been unresolved and unprocessed or perhaps misplaced. We're thinking the problem is somebody outside of us in our current reality, when it's really something that happened 30 years ago that we never were able to deal with. The emotional pain was so great. And until we look at it and process it and understand it for what it is, and put the pain and name it and claim it in the right place, we can never move beyond it. So I see myself in some ways as a tapeworm, emotional tapeworm, a charmer, and trying to coax that unprocessed grief, letting the pus run on a heart boil, and a festering heart wound that needs to heal before a person can really be free to make progress in spiritual life. Crucial point. So that's all I'm going to say about that right now. This is Rambrudasi at bhakticare.blogspot.com. Thank you for watching.